An entire community can vanish from the earth, leaving only questions behind. Medieval history is haunted by these mass disappearances, from thriving colonies to legendary armies. We are about to explore 30 of the world's most baffling cases, a journey into the heart of historical mystery. You will discover the chilling facts behind lost fleets, ghost villages, and settlements that evaporated into the mists of time. How does an entire civilization simply stop? Where did the children of a doomed crusade truly go? By the end, you will possess a collection of the strangest true stories from the past, where history and legend become inseparable. What do you believe is the most terrifying force that can erase a people from history? Deep in the Arctic silence stand stone walls that once echoed with Norse. The eastern settlement in Greenland was the pinnacle of Viking expansion, a community of nearly 4,000 souls at its peak. For centuries, this was not a struggling outpost but a thriving hub of commerce. Their wealth was built on a unique treasure, walrus ivory, which they traded across Europe for timber, iron, and other vital goods they could not produce on the icy island. A bishop officiated a wedding at Valsey Church in the early 1400s, an event recorded in distant texts. That is the last certain word we have from them. After that, only silence. So what happened to an entire colony of hardened Norse farmers? The most compelling theory points to a changing world. The Little Ice Age began to grip the region, extending the sea ice and shortening the already brief growing season. Summers became too cold to reliably grow hay to feed livestock through the long, dark winter. Starvation likely stalked the settlements. Others suggest conflict with the Skraelings, the Norse name for the Inuit people who were far better adapted to the harsh environment. Yet evidence for large-scale violence is sparse. Perhaps the most human explanation is a slow, grinding exodus. As life became untenable, families may have simply given up, packing their belongings onto boats and sailing back to the relative comfort of Iceland or mainland Scandinavia, leaving their homes to the wind and snow. Today, the ruins at Valsey Church remain eerily intact, a ghostly silhouette against the Greenlandic sky. The walls are still tall and straight, a monument to a society that did not fall in a single cataclysm, but instead made a final, collective decision to simply walk away from their world. While the Norse chose to leave their world behind, another group set out to change theirs with even more tragic consequences. In the year 1212, a different kind of army began to form across France and the Rhineland. It was not composed of grizzled knights, but of children and teenagers, driven by a faith so pure they believed it could accomplish what generations of hardened soldiers could not. This was the Children's Crusade. A young shepherd boy from France named Stephen of Cloyes claimed to have been visited by Jesus, who gave him a sacred letter to deliver to the king. In Germany, a boy named Nicholas of Cologne gathered thousands of followers with a similar message. They believed their innocence and piety would allow them to peacefully convert Muslims in the Holy Land or simply cause the Mediterranean Sea to part for them, just as the Red Sea had for Moses. The sheer fervor of this movement is difficult to comprehend today. They marched south, a ragged column of the faithful, leaving their homes and families behind with a certainty that defied all logic. When they reached the coast at Marseille, the sea did not open. Instead, two shipowners offered them passage, claiming they were acting out of holy duty. 7 ships set sail. For 2 of them, the end was grimly certain. They were wrecked in a storm off the island of San Pietro, and every soul aboard was lost. The other 5 ships, however, reached their destination, but it was not the Holy Land. The children had been betrayed. They were sold into slavery in the bustling North African ports of Alexandria and Tunis. The historical records are fragmented, a mix of chronicler accounts and later legends, but the core tragedy remains. An entire generation of young believers simply vanished, either swallowed by the sea or dispersed into a life of servitude. Their crusade left no mark on the political map of the world. only a haunting question about the power of belief and the vulnerability of the innocent. The innocent faith of the children's crusade met a bitter end, but some disappearances erased not just a community, but an entire branch of the human family tree. On the remote Indonesian island of Flores, a different kind of people once thrived. They stood just over 3 feet tall, with small bodies and brains about a third the size of our own. To the modern world, they are known as Homo floresiensis, but many call them the hobbits. These tiny humans were not a myth. They were a resilient species who crafted stone tools and hunted dwarf elephants, surviving on their isolated island for hundreds of thousands of years. What makes their story so haunting is how recently they vanished. The most recent evidence we have suggests they were still there as recently as 50,000 years ago. This places them squarely in a world already shared with us modern humans who are spreading across the globe. For a time, 2 different kinds of human beings likely walked the same earth. So what caused the hobbits to disappear? One leading theory points to a colossal volcanic eruption on Flores. The layer of ash from Mount Api, a volcano that was catastrophically active around the time of their extinction, blankets the island. Such an event could have smothered their food sources and poisoned their water, devastating a population already living in a fragile, isolated ecosystem. Another, perhaps more unsettling, possibility is us. The arrival of Homo sapiens often coincides with the decline of other hominins. Did we outcompete them for vital resources? Was there direct conflict, or did we simply bring new diseases to which they had no immunity? The truth is that we may never know the exact cause. Their disappearance stands as a profound and silent mystery, the final end of a unique human lineage that survived for so long, only to fade away just as our own story was truly beginning. What other forms of humanity have we lost to the shadows of prehistory? The disappearance of entire peoples is one thing, but what about the complete erasure of a professional army? In the misty highlands of 2nd century Britain, a legend was born that has captivated imaginations for generations. It concerns the fate of Rome's famed 9th Legion, a hardened force of over 5,000 professional soldiers known as Legionia Hispana. This was not a band of raw recruits, it was an elite unit with a long and distinguished history. Yet according to the story, around the year 120 AD, this entire legion marched north from its fortress at York into the swirling mists of Caledonia and simply vanished from history. The romantic appeal is undeniable, a powerful Roman war machine swallowed whole by the wild, untamed land beyond the empire's frontier. It is a tale of imperial hubris meeting a brutal, unknown force. The historical evidence, however, paints a more complicated picture. It is true that the 9th Legion disappears from all surviving Roman military records after this period. A unit that had been meticulously documented for centuries suddenly leaves no more paper trail. This abrupt silence is the bedrock of the mystery, but was it truly annihilated in a single, catastrophic battle? Some historians point to a major uprising among the northern tribes around this time, a rebellion fierce enough to potentially wipe out a legion. The land was hostile, and the Roman grip on Britain was always tenuous. Yet no mass grave of Roman soldiers has ever been found in Scotland to support this dramatic end. The alternative theory is far less cinematic but equally plausible. The Roman army was a vast, bureaucratic machine that constantly shuffled its forces across the empire. It is entirely possible the 9th Legion was not destroyed but simply transferred. They could have been sent to fight in a different war, perhaps on the German frontier or in the east, and met their end there in some unrecorded engagement. Their destruction would have been a profound military and political embarrassment for Rome, something the empire might have actively chosen to cover up, scrubbing the legion from official histories to hide the shame of such a loss. This ambiguity is what allowed the legend to flourish in British folklore. The story of the Lost Legion became a powerful national myth, a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the land and its ancient people resisting a foreign invader. It speaks to a deep-seated desire for a dramatic, clean ending, a definitive battle where the wilderness triumphed over civilization. The truth is likely more mundane, lost to the decay of time and parchment. But the enduring power of the question remains: did 5,000 of Rome's finest soldiers march into the highlands and become one with the very mist they sought to conquer? The legend of the Lost Legion shows how an army can fade from history, but a colony leaves behind empty homes and broken lives. On the coast of what is now North Carolina, an entire community evaporated into the wilderness. In 1587, more than 100 English settlers, including women and children, established the Roanoke colony. Among them was Elena Dare, who gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child known to be born in the Americas. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for crucial supplies, a voyage delayed for years by war with Spain. When he finally returned in 1590, he found the settlement utterly abandoned. The houses had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed, suggesting a planned departure rather than a panicked flight. The only clue was a single word carved into a fort post, CROATOAN, and the letters CRO carved into a tree. There was no cross, the prearranged sign for distress. They were just gone. So where did they go? The most enduring theory is that the colonists, facing starvation and desperate, split into smaller groups and integrated with local Native American tribes, specifically the Croatan people who lived on a nearby island. The carvings could have been a straightforward message indicating their destination. Over generations, stories and even physical evidence emerged among later settlers of gray-eyed Native Americans and communities who spoke English and used English tools. Another possibility is that the colony was wiped out by a concerted attack from a hostile confederation of tribes, or perhaps by the Spanish who saw the settlement as a threat. Yet the lack of skeletal remains or evidence of a struggle makes this theory difficult to prove. The true fate of the lost colony remains America's oldest cold case, a haunting puzzle of a community that stepped out of the fort's gate and into the silent, waiting forest, leaving behind only a name carved in wood and a mystery that has endured for centuries. While the Roanoke colony vanished into an American wilderness, a Scottish castle held its own secret, one of missing nobility rather than commoners. In the heart of Midlothian, Roslin Castle was the formidable seat of the powerful St. Clare family, the Earls of Orkney and Caithness. They were giants of medieval Scotland, wealthy beyond measure and with blood ties to the royal Stuart line. Yet one night in the late 1500s, a significant branch of this mighty dynasty simply ceased to exist. The story tells of a grand banquet held within the castle's great hall. The lord, his immediate family, and their children gathered for a feast, celebrating in the warmth and light of the roaring hearth. The following morning, they were gone. Not a single one of them could be found. The beds were unslept in, and no trace of a struggle marked the ancient stone floors. It was as if they had been plucked from the feast and erased from the world. What could explain such a clean and total disappearance from a heavily guarded fortress? The most dramatic theory suggests a swift and brutal political assassination. The St. Clairs were deeply enmeshed in the treacherous politics of the era, and such a complete removal would have been a powerful message to their rivals. Yet the lack of any bodies, any blood, any evidence of a fight makes this theory deeply puzzling. How could an entire family be murdered without leaving a single clue behind within their own home? Another possibility is that they staged their own disappearance. Perhaps they were threatened and chose to flee in the dead of night, using secret passages known only to the family to escape some impending doom. Their immense wealth could have financed a new life elsewhere under assumed names, leaving their titles and lands behind for the safety of anonymity. Then there are the local tales, whispered for generations, that speak of a more supernatural cause. Some say the family was spirited away by the fairy folk, taken into the nearby hills as payment for some forgotten pact or insult. These ghost stories persist, a folk memory trying to rationalize the utterly inexplicable. The practical consequence was very real, however. Their sudden absence created an immediate power vacuum, with distant relatives scrambling to claim the vast scent. Clare inheritance, the true fate of the Lord and his children, remains one of Scotland's most intimate and chilling mysteries. A puzzle where the only clues are empty rooms and the echo of a feast that ended in silence. The silent halls of Roslin Castle speak of a vanishing nobility, but the sea can swallow armies of a scale that dwarfs even the grandest of castles. No disappearance in medieval history can match the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of the lost fleets of Kublai Khan. The Mongol emperor, ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in history, set his sights on the island nation of Japan. In 1274, he sent a formidable armada of nearly 900 ships. This first invasion force met with fierce resistance and was ultimately forced to withdraw. But Kublai Khan was not a man accustomed to failure. 7 years later, he assembled a second fleet so vast its numbers strained belief. Historical records describe over 4,000 ships and a force of 140,000 men, a mix of Mongol warriors, Chinese infantry, and Korean sailors. It was arguably the largest invasion fleet the world would ever see until the D-Day landings of the 20th century. This colossal armada descended upon Japan's shores in 1281, landing in Hakata Bay. The Japanese defenders, massively outnumbered, fought a desperate holding action from their coastal fortifications, knowing they faced almost certain annihilation. Then the weather changed. For 2 days, a monstrous typhoon, a storm of biblical fury, hammered the Mongol fleet as it lay at anchor. The Japanese gave this storm a name, kamikaze, which means divine wind. They saw it not as a simple act of nature, but as a direct intervention from their gods, sent to protect the sacred islands from the foreign invader. The results were apocalyptic. The fragile, hastily assembled Korean and Chinese vessels were utterly destroyed. Thousands of ships were dashed against the rocks or pulled beneath the waves. The sea became a churning grave for nearly the entire invasion force. 140,000 soldiers and sailors, an army larger than the population of many medieval cities, vanished into the water. Their bodies washed ashore for weeks, a grim tide that littered the coastlines. This event was more than a military defeat. It was a foundational moment for Japan. The belief in their status as a divinely protected nation, the land of the gods, was cemented by the kamikaze. The disappearance of Kublai Khan's fleet was not a quiet mystery, but a cataclysm witnessed by an entire nation, an event that reshaped a country's destiny and left a legacy that would echo for centuries. What other single storm has ever so decisively rewritten the course of history? The fury of a divine wind is one thing, but the quiet despair of an entire village is another. In the deep forests of 16th century Franconia, in what is now Germany, the small village of Ansbach simply ceased to be. This was not a colony abandoned, nor an army defeated. It was a community of ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen, who one day were there and the next day were gone. The lore tells a story of profound suffering. The villagers were said to be crushed under the weight of relentless persecution from their local lord, their lives defined by backbreaking taxes and arbitrary cruelty. To this was added the gnawing hunger of poverty and the ever-present shadow of the plague, which swept through Europe in repeated, devastating waves. They had reached a point of collective despair, a silent agreement that their current existence was no longer worth enduring. The story goes that on one particular night, the entire population gathered in the town square. They brought nothing with them, leaving their homes fully furnished, their tools in the workshops, and their livestock in the pens. There, under the cover of darkness, they made a pact and vanished from the face of the earth. What could possibly explain such an event? Historical records from the region are frustratingly sparse, but they do confirm that the village was real and that it was indeed abandoned around this time. The official explanations are grimly practical. A particularly virulent outbreak of plague could have wiped out the entire population in a matter of weeks. In such a scenario, the last surviving individual might have been too weak to bury the others, leaving a ghost town for outsiders to discover. Alternatively, the persecution may have become so intolerable that the villagers staged a mass exodus, fleeing under cover of night to start anew elsewhere, perhaps in a different principality where their lord held no sway. They would have had to leave everything behind to avoid detection. Yet the folk tales are not satisfied with such mundane endings. They speak of something more mystical. Some legends suggest the villagers made a pact with the earth itself, that the ground opened up and swallowed them whole, granting them a peaceful rest far from their suffering. Others whisper of an intervention by the Erlkönig, the mythical elf king, who led them away into his hidden realm in the forests, a place from which they would never return. These stories persist because they offer a form of poetic justice, a magical escape for people who had no escape in the real world. The truth of Ansbach is likely a heartbreaking blend of history and legend. A real tragedy of disease or flight became woven into a folk memory, a cautionary tale about the limits of human endurance. It is a mystery that speaks not to external forces like storms or armies, but to the internal breaking point of a community and the eerie silence they left behind. A different kind of disappearance unfolded not in a single night but over generations. In the rolling hills of northern England, the medieval village of Warham Percy thrived for centuries. Its stone church, manor house, and rows of peasant cottages were home to a bustling community bound by the rhythms of farming life. Today, all that remains are a series of gentle, grassy mounds arranged in lines, the ghostly footprints of homes long since returned to the earth. This was not a sudden catastrophe or a military defeat. The people of Warham Percy were slowly, systematically erased by an economic revolution. The culprit was a process known as enclosure. In the 15th and 16th centuries, England's wealthy landowners realized that wool was far more profitable than wheat. A single shepherd and his dog could manage vast flocks of sheep on land that had once required dozens of farming families to work. So, the lords of the manor began to enclose the common fields, evicting the tenant farmers who had worked that land for generations. Their homes were dismantled stone by stone, the rubble forming those haunting mounds we see today. The church fell into disuse, its congregation gone. One by one, families were forced to leave, becoming refugees in their own country, pushed towards the growing cities in search of any kind of work. There was no single moment of tragedy, no dramatic last stand. It was a quiet, relentless dispersal, a community unraveling thread by thread until only the silence remained. Walking through Warham Percy now, you stand on a landscape transformed not by nature but by commerce. The empty fields tell a story of progress for the few and a profound, lingering loss for the many. How many other villages simply faded away when the people who gave them life were no longer needed? Far to the west of Greenland, the Norse pushed their luck into a land of forests and grapes. They called it Vinland, a name that spoke of a promise far greater than the icy shores they had left behind. According to the Icelandic sagas, this was the adventure of Leif Erikson, who around the year 1000 established a small settlement on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Today, we know this place as Elant's Ox Meadows, the first and only confirmed Norse site in North America. For a brief, shining moment, it was a reality. The sagas describe a land so rich that livestock could graze freely all winter and rivers teemed with salmon. The small group of settlers built sturdy longhouses and explored the coast, marveling at the bounty. Yet within a decade, perhaps just a few years, they packed their belongings, set their homes ablaze, and sailed away, never to return. So why abandon this paradise? The sagas point to a single, overwhelming reason: fear. The Norse called the native people they encountered Skraelings, a term that could mean barbarian or weaker one, but the reality they faced was anything but weak. The indigenous Beothuk or Micmac people were numerous, skilled, and fiercely protective of their territory. The sagas recount violent clashes, describing how the natives used hide-covered boats and launched swarms of arrows. For the Norse, who were perhaps only a few dozen in number, every encounter was a potential massacre. They were hopelessly outnumbered and thousands of miles from any hope of reinforcement. Beyond the immediate threat of conflict, the settlement suffered from a fatal lack of support. Greenland and Iceland were themselves small, struggling communities. They could not spare the people, the timber, or the iron needed to sustain a colony across such a vast and dangerous ocean. Maintaining a regular supply line was virtually impossible. The venture was simply not profitable enough to justify the immense risk. There was no gold or silver to ship back, only the promise of timber and furs, resources that could be found closer to home with far less danger. In the end, Vinland was an experiment that failed. The Norse chose survival over ambition. They retreated back across the sea to their established settlements in Greenland, taking with them only the stories that would eventually become the sagas. For centuries, their brief foothold in the New World was considered a myth, until archaeologists uncovered the ghostly outlines of those very longhouses at Elant's Oaks Meadows. It stands as a haunting what-if of history. What if they had persevered? What if they had found a way to coexist? The answer is written in the ashes of their abandoned homes and the enduring silence that followed their departure. High on a Pyrenean peak, the fortress of Montségur stood as the final bastion of a faith under siege. For months, the army of the Albigensian Crusade had surrounded this mountain stronghold, the last refuge of the Cathars, a Christian sect the Church had declared heretical. In March of 1244, after a brutal siege, the defenders finally negotiated a surrender. The terms were stark. Any who renounced their Cathar faith would be spared. Those who did not would face the flames. On the morning of March 16th, over 200 men and women, the spiritual elite known as the Perfecti, made their choice. They walked calmly down the mountainside and into a large palisade built by their captors. There, they were burned alive in a single, horrific pyre, a mass execution meant to extinguish their belief forever. Yet, even as this public tragedy unfolded, a deeper mystery was taking root. In the days just before the surrender, under the cover of a treacherous winter night, a small group of Perfecti is said to have slipped through the Crusader lines. According to local legend, these few escapees carried with them a great treasure. It was not gold or jewels, but something the Cathars considered far more precious, perhaps their sacred texts, their accumulated wealth, or even a revered religious relic. They vanished into the labyrinthine valleys and caves of the Pyrenees, swallowed by the landscape. No reliable record confirms their fate. Did they find sanctuary in a remote village, their lineage continuing in secret? Were they hunted down and killed, their treasure lost forever? Or did they simply become one with the mountains, their knowledge and their faith dissolving into the local folklore of hidden valleys and ghostly apparitions? The mystery of Montségur is a double disappearance, the very public destruction of the many, and the tantalizing, silent escape of the few. A ghost story that haunts the history of one of the medieval world's most brutal religious wars. The silence left by the Cathars was absolute, but on a windswept Scottish island, another spiritual community was erased in a single, brutal hour. The Isle of May sits in the Firth of Forth, a small sliver of land that once pulsed with prayer. A monastery was founded there, likely in the early centuries of Celtic Christianity, a remote sanctuary for monks seeking solitude with God. They built a simple stone church and humble dwellings, their lives defined by the rhythm of the tides and their chants. Then, according to chronicles written centuries later, the peace was shattered. In the 9th century, the longships appeared on the horizon. Viking raiders searching for wealth and slaves found the isolated island monastery a perfect, undefended target. The attack would have been swift and merciless. The monks were not warriors, they were men of parchment and prayer, utterly unprepared for the storm of violence that descended upon them. The historical account is chillingly succinct. It states that the entire community was killed or captured, their home plundered and put to the torch. In one morning, every soul on the Isle of May was gone. Those who were not cut down were likely dragged in chains back to the longships to be sold in distant slave markets, their identities and faith swallowed by the brutal economy of the North. The island itself became a tombstone. For centuries afterward, it remained deserted, a place spoken of in hushed tones by fishermen who knew its grim history. The ruins of the monastery slowly crumbled, reclaimed by grass and seabirds. This was not a slow decline or a planned departure, it was a definitive termination. A beacon of learning and devotion was extinguished so completely that its precise location was lost until modern archaeology uncovered the foundations of that first church. The disappearance of the monks of May is a stark reminder of the fragility of peace in a violent age, where a community dedicated to the eternal could be wiped from the earth between one tide and the next. The field at Hastings was littered with the flower of Saxon England. King Harold was dead, his body mutilated beyond recognition, and with him fell his legendary housecarls. These were not common soldiers, but a professional warrior elite, bound by oaths and paid in rings of gold. They fought with such ferocity that they were nearly annihilated, standing shoulder to shoulder around their king until the last man fell. Yet in the chaotic aftermath, as William secured his bloody victory, a question lingered. Did every single one of these hardened fighters truly perish on that hill? The chronicles go silent, but legend whispers a different tale. It suggests that a core of survivors, perhaps hundreds of men, refused to bend the knee to the Norman invader. For these men, surrender was a dishonor worse than death. Their world had ended on that October day, so where could such a conspicuous group of armed, trained, and desperate men possibly go? They could not return to their homes, for their lands were already being parceled out to William's followers. One compelling theory is that they melted away into the landscape, becoming ghosts in their own country. Some may have fled north to the wild hills of Northumbria, where Saxon resistance smoldered for years. Others, perhaps, vanished into the vast and trackless fens of East Anglia. This was a labyrinth of waterways and marshes, a place where a man could disappear forever. It was a world apart, where local people lived by their own rules and outsiders were easily spotted. A band of housecarls, with their discipline and combat skill, could have become the warlords of this forgotten realm. They would have established hidden settlements on isolated islands, surviving through fishing, raiding, and the loyalty of the local population who shared their hatred of the Normans. Over generations, these men would have passed down their stories, their bitterness, and their skills. They became the stuff of local folklore, the spectral Saxon warriors said to haunt the misty fens, a lingering echo of a lost cause. Their disappearance was not a mystery of a single night, but a slow fading into myth. They chose to become ghosts of the marsh rather than subjects of a foreign king, their final fate as shrouded as the lands they retreated into. The housecarls chose to vanish into the fens, but some communities are preserved in their final moments by the earth itself. Far to the north, on the Orkney Islands, the stone village of Skara offers a more intimate mystery. This was not a medieval fortress but a Neolithic settlement, older than Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids, yet its story of abandonment feels unnervingly recent. For over 4,000 years, a massive sand dune buried the entire village, protecting it from the elements and freezing it in a single, breathless moment in time. When a great storm finally scoured the sand away in the 19th century, it revealed a ghost town. The stone beds were still there, the central hearths cold for millennia. Dressers stood against the walls, and stone tools lay where they had been last set down. A cache of precious necklaces made from animal teeth and whalebone was left behind. It was a home fully furnished with the family missing. Why would an entire community abandon not just their houses but their most prized possessions? The scene suggests a sudden, panicked flight, not a planned migration. One of the most compelling theories is that of a climatic catastrophe. Orkney is lashed by the North Atlantic, and a storm of unimaginable ferocity could have been the trigger. A colossal sandstorm or a tsunami generated by an undersea landslide might have inundated the village, forcing the inhabitants to run for their lives with only what they could carry. They may have intended to return when the danger passed, but were never able to. Another theory points to a slower, more insidious enemy, a gradual climate shift. As the weather grew colder and wetter, the sand dunes that had once protected their fields began to creep inward, swallowing their farmland and making survival impossible. The departure may have been the culmination of years of struggle, a final, sad decision to leave a doomed home. The silence of Skara Brae is profound. We walk through their narrow, covered passageways and look into their stone rooms, seeing a life interrupted. We know how they lived with their stone beds and indoor drains, but we will never know why they left everything behind. It is a mass disappearance captured in stone, a puzzle where the clues are all present, but the answer has been erased by 5,000 years of wind and sand. The quiet stones of Skara Brae hold the echo of a single lost village, but the fire that consumed the Library of Alexandria erased a universe of thought. Far more than a building was lost, it was the entire intellectual community that formed its living heart that vanished from the world. By the late medieval period, the great center of learning was a ghost of its former self. Imagine a beacon that had once attracted the finest minds across the known world, from Euclid laying down the principles of geometry to Archimedes designing his revolutionary engines of war. This was not merely a repository of scrolls, it was a vibrant, breathing academy, a place of constant debate and discovery where the very boundaries of human knowledge were pushed outward for centuries. The scholars themselves were the library's true treasure, a mass of intellect that collectively understood the movement of planets, the size of the Earth, and the principles of steam power. Their disappearance was not a single event, but a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. The first major fire, rumored to have been set by Julius Caesar's troops, destroyed an unknown number of texts. Later purges under Christian emperors targeted pagan knowledge, seeing the works of ancient philosophers as a threat to the faith. Scrolls were burned or scraped clean to make room for religious texts. Finally, with the Islamic conquest, the last remnants of the scholarly community were scattered to the winds. The great library's final demise was likely a result of simple, crushing neglect. Without patronage, without students, and without a society that valued its contents, the last keepers of the flame simply died out or left. The vast collection of papyrus and parchment, requiring constant recopying to survive, slowly decayed in forgotten rooms, eaten by insects, damp, and time. The mass of knowledge and the intellectuals who curated it did not go up in a single, dramatic blaze. They faded away, volume by volume, mind by mind. This represents the disappearance of an entire world of ancient science and philosophy. The loss was so profound it set human progress back by centuries. The scholars of Alexandria had mapped stars we would not see again for 1,000 years, and they possessed ideas about medicine and mechanics that would be rediscovered only in the Renaissance. Their vanishing act is perhaps the most costly in all of history, for it was not just a people who were lost, but the very light of their understanding, leaving the world in a much darker place. Ancient maps and chronicles sometimes hold the ghosts of entire nations. Among these spectral peoples are the Bebrices, a tribe whose name echoes from the classical world into the early medieval era, only to fade into utter silence. Greek poets and historians place them in the wild, mountainous regions of what is now northwestern Turkey and parts of the Balkans, portraying them as a fierce, warlike people often clashing with Greek heroes. They were a fixture of the ancient landscape, real enough to be documented by multiple sources. Yet by the time the early Middle Ages were firmly established, every mention of them ceases. They vanish from tax rolls, military chronicles, and geographical texts as if they never were. So what became of a people who once held territory and identity? The most likely explanation is a slow, complete assimilation. Wave after wave of invasion and migration washed over their homeland. The Romans, with their relentless drive for order, absorbed countless tribes into their vast imperial machine. Later, as the Roman Empire crumbled, new groups like the Goths, the Slavs, and the Bulgars moved through the same territories. The Bebryces, perhaps already weakened or their culture diluted, may have simply been absorbed. Their children would have married into these new groups, their language would have been forgotten in favor of Latin or a Slavic tongue, and their unique tribal identity would have melted away over a few generations. They did not disappear in a day, but their name was the last thing to go. Another, darker possibility is conquest and eradication. The ancient world was brutally efficient at wiping rival cultures from the map. A particularly decisive military defeat could have led to the slaughter of their warrior class and the enslavement of the remaining population, scattering them so thoroughly that their community could never reform. Their towns might have been renamed, their stories suppressed, until all that remained was a vague memory in the songs of their neighbors. Yet there is a third, more philosophical possibility that haunts the study of such lost tribes. Perhaps the Bebryces were never a single, unified people in the way we understand. Classical writers often grouped diverse mountain clans under a single name for convenience. The name Bebryces might have been a blanket term for several different groups who shared a similar region and way of life. As the centuries passed and record-keeping became more precise, this vague classical label simply fell out of use, replaced by the specific names of the actual communities living there. The tribe did not vanish, the category did. Their story lives in that uncertain space between history and legend, a reminder that a people can be erased not just by the sword, but by the pen and by the slow, inexorable tide of forgetting. Within the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, a royal mystery was born from a struggle for power. Two boys, the sons of King Edward IV, were the central figures in this tragedy. The older brother, just 12 years old, was the rightful King Edward V. His younger brother, Richard, the Duke of York, was only 9. Following their father's sudden death, their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named their protector. He placed them in the royal apartments within the tower, which was then a palace as much as a prison, to await the older boy's coronation, but that coronation never came. Instead, their uncle declared the marriage of their parents invalid, rendering the boys illegitimate and barring them from the throne. He then crowned himself King Richard III. After his coronation in July of 1483, the two princes were seen less and less. Then they were not seen at all. They had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The most obvious suspect has always been their uncle, the new king. Richard III had the most to gain from their deaths. With the boys alive, his claim to the throne was fragile, a constant target for rebellion. Two living, legitimate heirs were a permanent threat to his reign. He had the means, the opportunity, and a powerful motive. Yet no direct evidence from the time explicitly names him as the murderer. Was he a ruthless usurper who ordered the deaths of his own nephews to secure his power? Or was he a capable ruler unfairly maligned by the dynasty that followed him? That dynasty gives us another prime suspect. Just 2 years later, Richard III was killed in battle by Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII. Henry solidified his own weak claim to the throne by marrying the prince's older sister. But if the boys were still alive, his wife had a stronger claim than he did. Their continued existence was as much a danger to him as it had been to Richard. Supporters of this theory point out that Henry never produced the boys to prove they were dead, nor did he ever publicly accuse Richard of their murder during his own reign. It was only years later that the accusation became official. Did Henry VII, finding the boys still alive in the tower, quietly arrange for their disposal and then pin the crime on his defeated predecessor? For centuries, the fate of the princes was pure speculation, a ghost story whispered in English history. Then, in the 17th century, workers making renovations to the tower made a grim discovery. Beneath a staircase, they found a wooden chest containing the skeletons of 2 children. Their ages matched the missing princes. The bones were eventually buried in Westminster Abbey, but modern examination confirmed they were from the correct time period. This proved they had died, likely around the time of their disappearance, but it could not prove how or by whose command. The tiny bones offered evidence but no answers. The mystery endures as a chilling puzzle of power, family, and the ultimate cost of a crown. Were these 2 young boys the final, silent victims of a war that consumed their own family? The fate of princes in a London tower was sealed by politics and power, but the disappearance of an entire city unfolded in plain sight under the glare of modern cameras. The Kowloon walled city in Hong Kong was a place that defied all logic, a monstrous, living structure that grew from a tiny seed of medieval history. Its origins lay in the Song dynasty, a small fort established to manage the salt trade. Centuries later, it became a Chinese enclave within British-controlled territory, a legal loophole that would define its destiny. By the late 20th century, it was a place where laws did not reach, a densely packed hive of humanity that operated by its own brutal rules. The city was not governed by any outside power, but by the triads who controlled its shadowy corridors and by the sheer, unyielding will of its 50,000 residents. It was a world of its own making, a society built vertically in a space no larger than a few city blocks. Sunlight barely touched the ground, filtered through a tangled web of dripping water pipes and illegal electrical cables. The air was thick with the smells of steamed buns, industrial grease, and untreated waste. Dentists and doctors practiced without licenses, their clinics operating next to unregulated factories pumping out fish balls or plastic goods. Entire families lived in single rooms, their lives a constant hum of industry and survival, all stacked atop one another in a labyrinth of stunning complexity. Everyone knew this could not last. The end was not a mystery of where the people went, but a question of how such a deeply rooted community could be unmade. In the early 1990s, the governments of Hong Kong and China made a final, decisive move. They declared the walled city a blight, a dangerous and unsanitary anomaly that had to be erased. The mass eviction was a colossal undertaking. For months, officials worked to relocate tens of thousands of residents, offering them modern apartments in exchange for their squalid, yet fiercely defended homes. There was resistance, of course. This was not just a slum, it was a home, a society, a complete ecosystem. But the pressure was relentless. Then the demolition crews moved in. The destruction was methodical and absolute. The bizarre, beautiful, and terrifying architecture was pulverized into dust. In its place, they built a peaceful, orderly park. The disappearance of the Kowloon walled city was a planned, bureaucratic erasure. It was not a silent fading, but a loud, deliberate termination. The community was scattered, its unique way of life extinguished forever. Today, you can walk through the serene gardens and ponds of Kowloon walled city park, and it is almost impossible to believe that this was once the densest place on Earth. The walled city is gone, but its memory lingers as a ghost of a different kind of disappearance, one where a world was not lost to time, but deliberately dismantled by the world that surrounded it. The sudden arrest of the Knights Templar sent a shockwave across Europe, but their ships were already gone. On that fateful Friday, the 13th in 1307, when King Philip IV of France moved to seize their legendary wealth, a key part of their power was missing. Their entire fleet, anchored at the vital port of La Rochelle, had vanished overnight. According to persistent legends, a convoy of Templar galleys slipped their moorings and sailed into the Atlantic mists, taking with them not just gold and silver, but something far more valuable, the Order's secret archives and the true source of their influence. Where could such a conspicuous fleet possibly go? One compelling theory points north to Scotland. The Templars were known to have close ties with Scottish nobles, and King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Pope, would have had no reason to honor the arrest order. A hidden base on the remote Scottish coast would have offered perfect sanctuary. Could their knowledge and wealth have even helped fund Bruce's campaign for independence? Another possibility leads to Scandinavia. The Templars had established trade links and properties there, and the complex politics of the Baltic region could have provided a refuge far from the reach of the French king. But the most tantalizing speculation pushes their voyage even further. Did the Templar fleet, possessing advanced nautical charts from their decades of travel, possess knowledge of lands across the ocean? Could they have sailed west, reaching the shores of North America nearly 2 centuries before Columbus? Proponents of this idea point to carvings in New England and Nova Scotia that some believe resemble Templar symbols, though mainstream historians remain deeply skeptical. The truth is that no wreckage of their ships was ever found, and no definitive record of their destination has surfaced. They did not disappear in a storm or a battle. They executed a perfect, premeditated escape. Their vanishing act was so complete it suggests a deep, secret network and a plan long in the making. The lost fleet became a ghost story, its legacy woven into the myths of hidden treasures and secret societies that endure to this day. What could have been so important that it required such a flawless and final disappearance from the pages of history? Deep in the Welsh borderlands, a field of bumps and hollows hides a stunning secret. This tranquil landscape was once the thriving boomtown of Trelech, a bustling urban center that rivaled London in size and importance during the 13th century. Founded by the powerful de Clare family, its wealth was forged in fire and iron. The town became an industrial powerhouse, its hillsides dotted with charcoal burners and its air thick with smoke from countless bloomeries, the simple furnaces used to smelt local iron ore. This industry demanded workers, and people flocked to Trelech, building homes, a church, and a castle, creating a population that may have reached 10,000 souls. For a time, it was one of the largest towns in all of Wales. Then it was gone. So how does a metropolis simply return to pasture? The most immediate suspect is war. Trelech was tragically positioned in the Marches, the contested borderland between English lords and Welsh princes. It was a target during the Great Welsh Rebellions of the 13th century. Historical records confirm the town was sacked and burned not once but multiple times. In 1282, the forces of Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, the last native prince of Wales, razed Trelech to the ground. Rebuilding from such an attack was a monumental task, and each assault would have chipped away at the community's will and resources. Another, more insidious force was also at work, the Black Death. When the plague swept through Britain in the mid-14th century, it preyed upon densely populated areas. A crowded, industrial town like Trelech would have been a perfect breeding ground for the pestilence, potentially wiping out a huge portion of its population in a matter of months. But perhaps the most complete explanation is a slow unraveling. After the Welsh rebellions were finally crushed, the strategic reason for Trelech's existence began to fade. The political strife that had made it a target also subsided, and the economic winds shifted. The local iron deposits may have been exhausted, or more efficient production methods elsewhere made its industry obsolete. People simply drifted away to more stable and prosperous places, their homes slowly crumbling until only the foundations remained, waiting to be swallowed by the soil. Today, the story of Trelech is literally rising from the earth as archaeologists carefully uncover the outlines of its streets and workshops. The town did not vanish in a single cataclysm, but through a combination of fire, disease, and economic decay, a ghost whose presence you can still feel in the quiet, rolling Welsh fields. The road to salvation was paved with unmarked graves. For every pilgrim who reached the holy city of Santiago de Compostela, countless others simply never arrived. These were not solitary travelers, but entire groups, whole communities of the faithful who banded together for safety on the long, dangerous journey from across Europe. A single party could number in the dozens, a moving village of men, women, and children united by their devotion, and then, without warning, the trail would go cold. Their families back home would wait, season after season, for a return that never came. The routes were a gauntlet of hidden dangers. In the wild passes of the Pyrenees, a sudden blizzard could descend in minutes, blinding a group and leaving them to freeze just feet from the path. Avalanches could sweep an entire column off a mountain ledge, burying them under tons of snow and rock without a trace. Then there were the human predators. Thieves and bandits knew these roads were thick with vulnerable travelers carrying what little wealth they had for the journey. An ambush in a narrow gorge could be swift and total. To leave no witnesses, these outlaws would often kill everyone, dumping the bodies into a ravine or a hidden pit, ensuring the pilgrim party vanished into the landscape as if they had never existed. For those who chose the sea route, the perils were just as great. Pilgrim ships, often overcrowded and unseaworthy, faced the full fury of the Atlantic. A storm could dash a vessel against the rocky Galician coast, pulling every soul aboard into the deep. There would be no wreckage to find, no bodies to bury, just an empty stretch of ocean where a ship full of prayers had been. And always there was the silent, creeping threat of disease. A pilgrim hostel could become a death trap when plague or typhus broke out. A sickened group, too weak to travel, might perish together in an isolated barn or a forest clearing, their remains scattered by animals long before anyone found them. These mass disappearances were a quiet, accepted horror of the age. A party would set out from their hometown amid blessings and tears, and then nothing. No letter, no rumor, no word from other travelers. They became names on a parish list, a permanent question mark in their family's history. Their fate remains one of the pilgrimage's darkest legacies, a reminder that the path to heaven was often a one-way road through a very real and unforgiving earth. High on a sun-baked plateau, the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde stand as a silent city. These were not crude shelters, but intricate multi-story structures tucked into vast sandstone alcoves, a testament to the ingenuity of the ancestral Pueblones, a people often known by the Navajo name Anasazi. For generations, they thrived here, farming the mesa tops and raising families in rooms carved from the living rock. Then, around the year 1300, they walked away from it all. They left behind pottery in the corners, tools on the floors, and the very stones of their homes, vanishing into the desert. The question of why they abandoned such a masterpiece of architecture has haunted historians for centuries. One undeniable force was the climate. The region was gripped by a great drought that lasted for decades. The already arid land received even less rain, causing springs to dry up and cornfields to fail. In a place where every drop of water was precious, a prolonged drought was not just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. How long can a community watch its children thirst before it must move? Yet climate alone may not tell the whole story. Some archaeologists point to evidence of social turmoil. The later dwellings at Mesa Verde are noticeably more defensive, built in harder-to-reach cliffs and with features that suggest a fear of conflict. Had years of scarce resources fractured their society, turning neighbor against neighbor? Did internal strife make their once sacred homes feel like prisons? Another theory suggests they simply exhausted their environment. A growing population living in a concentrated area would have placed immense pressure on local resources. They needed vast amounts of timber for roof beams and firewood, and they hunted local game to scarcity. The very land that sustained them may have been unable to support their numbers any longer. But the most compelling theory is not one of disappearance, but of transformation. The people did not vanish from the earth, they likely migrated. Oral histories from the Hopi and Zuni peoples, whose pueblos have been continuously inhabited for centuries, tell of their ancestors coming from places like Mesa Verde. This was not a chaotic flight, but a deliberate, generations-long migration to where water was more reliable and life could be sustained. They left their cliff houses behind, but they carried their culture, their knowledge, and their community with them, weaving it into the fabric of new nations that endure to this day. The empty stones of Mesa Verde are not a tomb, but a monument to a difficult choice, a testament to a people who chose a future over a fortress. The stones of Great Zimbabwe still stand in silent witness to a vanished kingdom. In the highlands of southern Africa, this city of majestic, dry stone walls and conical towers was the thriving heart of a vast empire that flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries. It was a center of extraordinary wealth and power built on a foundation of gold. The kingdom controlled a network of trade routes that stretched to ports on the Swahili coast, where its gold, ivory, and copper were exchanged for fine Chinese celadon pottery, Persian glass, and Indian beads. Tens of thousands of people once lived here within the great enclosure and in the surrounding valley, their lives governed by a sacred king. Yet by the time Portuguese explorers began mapping the African coast, the city was empty. What could cause a population to abandon such an impressive and prosperous capital? One of the most compelling reasons is that the city simply consumed its own prosperity. The very gold mines that created its wealth were finite. After centuries of intensive mining, the most accessible veins were likely exhausted. The land itself may have been pushed to its limits, with the surrounding forests cleared for timber and firewood, and the soil depleted from feeding such a large, concentrated population. The environment that had once supported a metropolis could no longer sustain it. Another possibility is that the world simply moved on. The trade routes that had been the kingdom's lifeblood began to shift. New ports opened, new alliances were forged, and the economic currents that had once flowed directly through Great Zimbabwe may have been rerouted, leaving the city isolated and economically stranded. Its reason for being, its connection to the wider world, slowly faded away. There is also the specter of political fragmentation. Without a strong, central authority, the intricate social structure that held the kingdom together could have unraveled. Rival chieftains may have broken away, leading their own followers to establish new, smaller settlements, effectively draining the capital of its people and its power. The great stone city was not destroyed by an invader. There is no evidence of a great fire or a sacking. Instead, the people seem to have simply left, drifting away over generations to join other Shona-speaking groups in the region. They carried their culture, their skills, and their lineage with them, assimilating into the wider fabric of southern Africa. The city itself was left to the elements, a grand and empty monument to a golden age that its own success had helped to end. How many other great capitals have been abandoned not by conquest, but by the slow, quiet withdrawal of the people who gave them life? The desert sands of Sudan hold the memory of an army born from prophecy. In the late 19th century, a charismatic Sufi mystic named Muhammad Ahmad declared himself the Mahdi, the expected redeemer of Islam, and ignited a holy war against the oppressive Ottoman Egyptian rulers. His forces were not a modern military, but a vast, fervent host of tribesmen, armed with spears and ancient rifles, united by a faith so powerful it toppled an empire. They captured Khartoum and established a strict Islamic state, but the Mahdi's reign was brief, his death leaving his successor, the Khalifa, to face the gathering storm of British imperial might. At the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, the modest army made its final, tragic stand. Ranks of devoted warriors charged across open ground, only to be systematically cut down by Maxim guns and modern artillery, a horrific clash of two worlds that left thousands dead on the field. The Khalifa himself died fighting, yet the story does not end on that bloody plain. In the chaotic aftermath, as the British and Egyptian forces secured their victory, a significant remnant of the Mahdi's forces simply melted away. These were not broken men, but hardened veterans who knew the desert was their ally. They turned their backs on the Nile and vanished into the immense, trackless wastes of the Sudanese desert, the Bayuda Desert and beyond. They were ghosts in their own land, dissolving into the very landscape that had sheltered their rebellion. So where did they go? Some likely returned to their ancestral tribes, slipping back into the familiar rhythms of nomadic life, their weapons hidden, their past as warriors a carefully guarded secret. Others may have formed small, isolated communities in remote oases, living out their days in quiet obscurity, their revolutionary faith becoming a private, personal matter. The British Army, despite its technological superiority, had no hope of pursuing them into that endless sea of sand. How do you find an army that has chosen to become one with the wind and the dunes? Their disappearance was a final act of defiance, a refusal to be captured, catalogued, or ruled. They escaped history itself, leaving behind only the whisper of their name and the enduring mystery of their final, silent march into the emptiness. The wedding at Valsey Church in 1408 was a defiant celebration in a world growing colder. We know from Icelandic records that a woman named Sigrid Björnsdóttir married a man named Thorstein Olafsson in a ceremony that would have gathered the community's remaining families. It was the last documented event in the entire eastern settlement, a final flicker of normal life recorded for posterity. After this entry, the historical record for Greenland simply stops. The priest who performed the rite, the families who feasted, the children who may have played outside the stone walls, they all step out of written history and into an impenetrable silence. So what became of the wedding guests? Did the entire community perish in the years that followed, or did they eventually make a successful, if tragic, exodus? The church itself offers no clues of violence or sudden disaster. Its walls stand complete, a silent sentinel overlooking the fjord. There are no scattered bones, no evidence of a struggle, just the enduring stonework waiting for a congregation that never returned. This suggests a slow, grinding departure rather than a single catastrophic event. The most likely scenario is a gradual abandonment. As the Little Ice Age tightened its grip, summers became too short to grow enough hay, and winters grew longer and more severe. The trade in walrus ivory, their economic lifeblood, may have collapsed as demand waned in Europe. Faced with starvation, families likely left in small groups over a period of years, packing their most precious belongings onto cargo ships and attempting the perilous voyage back to Iceland or Scandinavia. The wedding itself may have been a final gathering, a last happy occasion before the community made the collective decision to disband. Perhaps Sigrid and Thorstein were among the last to leave, closing the door on their home and sailing away from the empty church. Their ultimate fate is a complete historical blank. Did their ship founder in the icy North Atlantic? Did they reach Iceland and assimilate quietly into the population, their story lost to time? We will never know. The mystery of Valsey is not one of a dramatic end, but of a quiet, final bow, a community that chose to walk away from its world and vanish without a trace. A different kind of silence fell over the Balkans, the quiet erasure of an entire way of believing. The Bogomils were not a people defined by a single land, but by a radical and dangerous faith that spread like wildfire across medieval Bulgaria and Bosnia. They were Christian dualists, seeing the world as a battleground between two eternal forces, a good, spiritual God and an evil, material one. To them, the entire physical world, including the established churches with their ornate crosses and elaborate rituals, was the creation of the devil. This belief made them a direct threat to the immense authority of both the Orthodox Byzantine Empire and the Catholic West. Their priests lived in austere poverty, rejecting the wealth and power of the state-sanctioned clergy, and their message of spiritual purity resonated deeply with the poor and the disenfranchised. For a time, they built a resilient spiritual community that operated in the shadows, a secret network of believers who saw themselves as the only true Christians. But such a challenge could not be tolerated forever. The full force of two empires was eventually brought to bear upon them. the Byzantine Empire launched brutal military campaigns, hunting down their leaders and burning their texts. The Catholic Church, through the Inquisition, declared them heretics and pursued them with relentless fervor. The choice offered was grimly simple: recant or die. Many bogomils were burned at the stake, their bodies destroyed as their faith demanded their spirits be freed from the evil of the material world. Others, under the constant threat of torture and execution, underwent forced conversions, publicly adopting the state religion while perhaps privately holding to their old beliefs. Over generations, this relentless pressure did its work. Their communities were broken up, their unique scriptures were systematically burned, and their distinctive identity was slowly ground into dust. They did not vanish in a single battle or a sudden exodus, but through a slow, painful process of assimilation and suppression. Their beliefs were so thoroughly erased that much of what we know about them today comes from the writings of their enemies, who documented their heresies only to condemn them. The bogomils disappeared into the very populations that had persecuted them, their voice silenced, their story almost lost. How many other ways of seeing the world have been utterly erased by the winners of history? A merchant's entire fortune could dissolve into the North Sea, missed between one voyage and the next. The Hanseatic League was the economic superpower of medieval Northern Europe, a network of trading cities bound by contracts and convoys. From London to Novgorod, their cogs and hulks carried salt, wool, fur, and timber, creating immense wealth. Yet the ledger books of this vast enterprise are filled with chillingly simple entries: ship and crew overdue, presumed lost. An entire fleet, a small flotilla of vessels sailing together for protection, could simply fail to arrive at its destination. The sea they crossed was a place of profound danger, where navigation relied on the sun, the stars, and the hard-won experience of pilots who knew the coastlines. A sudden fog could disorient the most seasoned captain, leading his entire convoy onto a hidden sandbar or a jagged reef. In the brutal winters, the Baltic could freeze a ship in place, trapping its crew in a floating tomb of ice, their fate sealed by the slow, creeping cold. Then there were the storms, the North Sea gales that could churn the water into a fury capable of splintering heavy oak beams and swallowing ships whole. A single tempest could erase a dozen vessels from existence, sending hundreds of sailors and a king's ransom in cargo to the bottom, leaving no survivors to tell the tale. And if the weather spared them, human predators often did not. Pirates lurked in the narrow straits and amongst the countless islands, their swift longships descending on the slower, heavily laden merchant cogs. An attack was swift and merciless, the crews often killed and thrown overboard, the ships repurposed or scuttled, and the valuable goods sold on the black market. For a Hanseatic trading house, the loss of a single ship was a severe financial blow, but the disappearance of an entire fleet with all its crews, captains, and cargo could mean instant bankruptcy and ruin. These vanishings were a constant, grimly accepted cost of doing business, a reminder that the trade routes which built empires were also highways to a silent, unmarked grave. Even the most resilient communities could be erased by hunger. The Great Famine that gripped Europe from 1315 to 1317 was a slow-motion catastrophe, a relentless squeeze that did not just kill millions but made entire villages simply cease to be. This was not a sudden plague or a single battle, but a creeping void. Imagine a small hamlet, a cluster of families who had worked the same fields for generations. First, the unending rains came, summer after summer, turning the soil to mud and rotting the seed grain in the ground. The harvests failed completely. Then the livestock, the very measure of a family's wealth, began to starve. They were slaughtered for meat until there were none left. People ate the seed corn meant for the next planting. Then they boiled tree bark and hunted for grass. As the social fabric unraveled, the weak succumbed first, the elderly and the very young. Neighbors turned suspicious, hoarding what little they had. The local lord, who was supposed to offer protection and grain from his stores, often found his own reserves exhausted. There was no one left to help. The village priest would have buried the dead until he himself was too weak to dig. And then, one day, the last survivor, a person utterly alone in a landscape of empty huts and fallow fields, would simply walk away, joining the throngs of desperate wanderers on the roads or collapsing in a ditch never to be recorded again. When the rains finally stopped and the sun returned, there was no one left to till the soil. The forest would slowly creep back over the abandoned fields. The wooden houses would rot and collapse. Within a generation, all that remained was a faint pattern in the earth, a place name forgotten by the tax collector, a community that had not been destroyed but had been quietly, thoroughly unmade by the slow, grinding teeth of hunger. These 30 vanishings form a haunting tapestry woven from a few dark threads. Environmental catastrophe is the most common killer, a silent executioner that leaves no obvious scar. The Norse of Greenland and the people of CROATOAN were both defeated by a changing climate, one by encroaching ice and the other by creeping sand. Drought emptied the cliff cities of Mesa Verde and the stone metropolis of Great Zimbabwe, proving that even the grandest civilizations are fragile when the rains fail. Economic collapse unraveled communities just as completely. The village of Roanoke was not sacked by invaders but dismantled by the simple, brutal logic of profit, its people made obsolete by a shift from farming to sheep. The Hanseatic fleets vanished because the dangerous trade that sustained them was no longer worth the risk, their ships becoming tombs for abandoned commerce. Then there is the relentless specter of conflict and warfare. The monks of the Isle of May were erased by Viking raiders, their prayers cut short by the sword. The princes in the tower were likely victims of a familial war for power, their lives a small price for a crown, and disease, the great silent reaper, left villages like Ansbach as collections of empty homes, their populations felled by a plague that left no one to bury the dead. Finally, there is the simple, terrifying act of getting lost. The pilgrims on the road to Santiago, the soldiers of the 9th Legion, the colonists of Roanoke, they all stepped off the map of the known world and into the uncharted territory of mystery. Modern science is now shining a light into these dark corners. Dendrochronology, the science of dating tree rings, can tell us precisely when a great drought began or a fatal winter froze a settlement. By analyzing the width of each ring, we can read the annual diary of the climate, finding the exact year the rains stopped for the ancestral Pueblones. DNA analysis is even more revolutionary, allowing us to trace the genetic legacy of the lost. We can now search for the descendants of the Roanoke colonists within Native American populations or uncover the distant relatives of the Cathar Perfecti who may have escaped the flames of Montsaga. Archaeology has moved beyond simply digging up artifacts, using ground-penetrating radar to find the outlines of entire villages like Trelech without lifting a single trowel. Yet for all our technology, some mysteries may forever dwell in the realm of legend. We will likely never know the final fate of the Knights Templar fleet or the true fate of the princes in the tower, for these are stories written not in bone or stone, but in the whispers of history and the dark spaces of the human heart. The greatest mystery of all may be why we are so drawn to these ghost stories of the past, perhaps because they hold a mirror to our own fragile existence, reminding us that any community, no matter how great, is only a generation away from becoming a whisper on the wind. These 30 vanishings form a haunting tapestry woven from a few dark threads. Environmental catastrophe is the most common killer, a silent executioner that leaves no obvious scar. The Norse of Greenland and the people of CROATOAN were both defeated by a changing climate, one by encroaching ice and the other by creeping sand. Drought emptied the cliff cities of Mesa Verde and the stone metropolis of Great Zimbabwe, proving that even the grandest civilizations are fragile when the rains fail. Economic collapse unraveled communities just as completely. The village of Roanoke was not sacked by invaders but dismantled by the simple, brutal logic of profit, its people made obsolete by a shift from farming to sheep. The Hanseatic fleets vanished because the dangerous trade that sustained them was no longer worth the risk, their ships becoming tombs for abandoned commerce. Then there is the relentless specter of conflict and warfare. The monks of the Isle of May were erased by Viking raiders, their prayers cut short by the sword. The princes in the tower were likely victims of a familial war for power, their lives a small price for a crown. And disease, the great silent reaper, left villages like Ansbach as collections of empty homes, their populations felled by a plague that left no one to bury the dead. Finally, there is the simple, terrifying act of getting lost. The pilgrims on the road to Santiago, the soldiers of the 9th Legion, the colonists of Roanoke, they all stepped off the map of the known world and into the uncharted territory of mystery. Modern science is now shining a light into these dark corners. Dendrochronology, the science of dating tree rings, can tell us precisely when a great drought began or a fatal winter froze a settlement. By analyzing the width of each ring, we can read the annual diary of the climate, finding the exact year the rain stopped for the ancestral Pueblones. DNA analysis is even more revolutionary, allowing us to trace the genetic legacy of the lost. We can now search for the descendants of the Roanoke colonists within Native American populations or uncover the distant relatives of the Cathar Perfecti who may have escaped the flames of Montségur. Archaeology has moved beyond simply digging up artifacts, using ground-penetrating radar to find the outlines of entire villages like Trelech without lifting a single trowel. Yet for all our technology, some mysteries may forever dwell in the realm of legend. We will likely never know the final fate of the Knights Templar fleet or the true fate of the princes in the tower, for these are stories written not in bone or stone, but in the whispers of history and the dark spaces of the human heart. The greatest mystery of all may be why we are so drawn to these ghost stories of the past, perhaps because they hold a mirror to our own fragile existence, reminding us that any community, no matter how great, is only a generation away from becoming a whisper on the wind. Which of these 30 disappearances lingers most powerfully in your mind? Do you believe the people of Roanoke successfully integrated with the CROATOAN, or did the 9th Legion march into the Scottish mists to be erased by an unknown enemy? Share your own theories in the comments below and subscribe to join us on our next journey into the shadows of